Now, transgender issues are being discussed in the media now more than ever, with sports personalities among those making it known publicly that they identify as trans or non-binary, neither male nor female. But are they being treated equally? Not according to a report published by a government committee today, which suggests that the NHS and the prison service need urgent reform and more education is needed on trans issues. Our Home Affairs correspondent Darshana Soni has this report.
You live your life in the spotlight.
The time to be trans. 2015 was described as momentous for modern trans activism.
Mappa? Yeah, like Mama and Papa. Mappa.
With the fight for equality and understanding entering popular culture.
This is not my body.
And the mainstream media.
That was the first ever mention of transgender in a State of the Union address.
And in another first, Parliament has today published a report into transgender rights. But away from Hollywood and all the headlines, it's found that transgender people still face discrimination in nearly every aspect of their lives.
The Women and Equalities Committee estimates that there are around 650,000 gender incongruent people in the UK, and transphobia affects their mental health, careers and living standards.
Celebrities like Caitlyn Jenner, I think somebody who's made it more acknowledged. And
do you think that helps?
Yeah, she is definitely disturbed.
She's helped raise the awareness, perhaps not for the right reasons.
She's got security, she's got all the money in the world.
Yeah.
Other trans girls don't have that money to have plastic surgery and live the life she lives.
She doesn't have to worry about walking down the street and getting attacked.
Tiffany Eve and Tallulah Rose are campaigners and bloggers who support other young women transitioning. Tallulah was crowned Miss Transgender Birmingham and has made her own music.
Even when you fall, and yes, you're still beautiful.
Neither described themselves as camera shy, and yet they asked if we could film this interview in a gay-friendly bar because they say it's one of the few places where they won't attract abuse.
People do not understand the difference from a transgender to a gay person. I have people all the time getting confused about my sexuality, and also I get offers for doing porn, and it's just like it's a stigma still that we are just porn stars or sex workers.
As a woman of colour, is it more difficult for you?
So yeah, I find it really difficult because a lot of the black community feel that I'm like shaming them, and with them being like hardcore Christians and religious beliefs, they feel like it's against their religion and what they believe.
The committee found nearly half of young trans people have attempted suicide, and it's particularly critical of NHS services. Prisons are also criticised after the recent death of Vicky Thompson, a transgender woman sent to a men's prison. Campaigners say it's time to rethink official recognitions of gender.
Do we have to have F or M on our driving licence, on our passports even, or on other documentation? Maybe a removal of gender markers will help all people in society, and certainly people who are trans-identified or non-binary identified.
Tallulah Eve and Tiffany Rose say that despite the difficulties, they feel lucky to be living the lives they want to.
The trans community is at now where the gay community was like 10-15 years ago.
But although they have come to accept themselves, the rest of the world is a long way from doing so. Darshana Soni, Channel 4 News, Birmingham.
Well, joining me now are the food writer and transgender campaigner Jack Monroe, who is born a female but now identifies as non-binary, and the academic and feminist activist Dr. Julia Long. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Matt.
Jack, let me start with you. How important is this report today for you?
It is important to me. It's important that non-binary people are now getting, recognition in legal terms in the same way that gay people got recognition 20, 30 years ago, in the same way that we have legislation that means that people can't be hateful towards people with disabilities or people of different races or people of different genders. It's nice to now see that that provision is being extended to people like myself as well.
And we mentioned the NHS there in our introduction. I mean, give me some practical ideas of how this might change your life.
Well, that's a very, very big question for a very small interview.
Give me a short answer. Yeah.
What practical ideas? I mean, the NHS have admitted in the report that trans people are a hidden and badly treated group. I've got a lot of love for the NHS, I really have, but treatment for trans people varies widely depending on where you were born and the access to the services that you have. So if those services can be improved, as long as not at the detriment to any other groups, any other people needing treatment, then of course I welcome that.
Okay. Julia, do you agree with what Jack's saying?
Well, I'd like to begin by saying I think it's really ironic that the first act that this committee, which calls itself the Women and Equalities Committee, the first report that they publish is something that actually is thoroughly antithetical to women's rights. And
how so?
And the voices of women and women's organisations seem to have been very much ignored in the production of this report. There were a number of women's organisations and individuals who sent submissions into the inquiry. None of us were invited to speak at or testify at the inquiry, and so it seems that the only voices that the committee was interested in hearing were those from the transgender lobby and those invested in what has been termed the gender industry.
But how does that affect the feminist community?
So the way in which it affects, well, again, as Jack was saying there, it's quite difficult to encapsulate this in such a short interview, but so there are numerous ways in which it affects women. One of the most worrying ways, I would say, is in the threat that this poses to women-only spaces and women-only services, particularly women's refuges and those services which are set up to support women who've survived male violence or are maybe fleeing from male violence. For example, if we think about the case of Christopher Hambrook in Toronto a couple of years ago, you may have heard of this case, under Toby's law, which is a similar kind of law that this inquiry is recommending that we adopt in this country, which is a self-declaration system of gender, so that any man under that system could identify as a woman. He identified as a woman, called himself Jessica Hambrook, had access to 2 women's shelters and sexually assaulted 2 women within those shelters.
I think we can all pull cases out where we can say this has happened and that's happened, but those cases are very, very rare. And to try and deny services to women on the basis that those women might be trans women I find that abhorrent. I mean, I was raped by a cis man and again by a lesbian woman, but in the ages of 19 and 22. I don't use either of those experiences to try and deny cis straight men or gay women's access to rape crisis services. I think the kind of language that Jack is using there is really kind of illustrative of the heart of this problem, where even terms such as male and female are becoming meaningless under the kinds of recommendations. They're not meaningless. They've got a different meaning to the one that you want to assign.
But they're becoming
meaningless in terms of this report. If we talk about the prevalence of male violence against women, which we know is the proportions of a global pandemic. Women need safe spaces, and the recommendation in this report that men will be able to identify as women on the basis of a declaration has very, very serious implications. You're talking about, but who are you to decide who is a man and who is a woman? By use of terms men, I imagine that from what you're saying, you're talking about trans women and you're classing trans women as men, which is bang out of order for a start, and it is, and I speak my mind, it is, because trans women are women. And it's not for you to say that trans women are men, and it's not for you to say that being transgender is some sort of frivolous lifestyle choice. Somebody's going to decide one day, I want to assault some women, so I'm going to identify as female so I can get access to a rape crisis service. Because if men want to go out assaulting women, those men do. Rapists are rapists. Trans people are not rapists by default. There's been research undertaken in Sweden and in the US which shows that men who subsequently identify as so-called trans women commit violent crime, and including sex offending, at the same rates as men who, in Jack's language, would refer to as so-called cis men. So, I think it's a much wider issue than Jack is trying to present it as there.
Very fascinating, but we've got to leave it here, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for coming in, Julia Long, Jack Monroe. Thanks a lot. Over to you, John.